again, perhaps thinking about younger readers of poetry and how do we persuade younger people with all the exciting things that they could be doing with their time? And I don't think I was reading Shelley or Keats when I was 16, 17, 18. I think Keats has just been taken off the GCSE curriculum. And is there a way in which Shelley and Keats and Wordsworth have become part of the problem that a whole host of dead white men writing about lyric poems about nightingales? Why are we having to put up with all of this stuff? As you say, it's sort of interesting to think of Shelley sort of feeling hampered. Is there a way in which the Romantics particularly sort of feel hampering to the next generations of poets coming, yes, but also just the next generation of readers? Oh God, I've got to put up with Grecian urns. What is the intellectual hymn to intellectual beauty got to say to me?
Yes, I think that's a really good question, and I think it's paradoxical because I think, in a way, I think that anything that becomes compulsory learning and becomes a form of rote learning becomes inert and becomes one of those poisonous names. And certainly I was put off poetry at school.
Okay.
I mean, I hated it. Okay. It's just a kind of tedious set of form of indirect speech, which you're supposed to point out the kind of, dreary checklist of things going on in it. And I had absolutely no sympathy for it. I think that it helps to think about poetry biographically, because I think it helps in our reading of dead poets, but dead poets also help us if we can get to the point of recognizing that they see the poems as from the point of view of the writing of them rather than the point of view of the reading of them, and then from the point of view of the writing of them not only technically but being written by people in situated people who are struggling with being alive, which we all are. For people who love the Romantics and who get the Romantics and have charismatic teachers at the right age, the Romantics are a kind of siren call. Their siren call is, don't be obedient. Don't be a passive, consumer of the whatever it is you're supposed to be, a curriculum of duties or knowledge or whatever. Go and beat a path for yourself. The world is huge and beautiful and you can find a way in it. And actually they did do it first and in many ways better than many other poets. I mean, that was the strength of them as a movement. But it's very hard to access that life in their language in a way. It's very hard to access them, actually, oddly. And the more of a cliche, I Wandered Lonely is, for example, actually the worse our access is, because they've become the departed dead. They've become poison names rather than part of a kind of, living chain of, in the way that, people who are dead but are proponents of music that people still listen to. I don't know, even like classic rock and roll, I don't know, whatever, or bands from 20 years ago, but actually, everyone is incredibly eclectic now and everyone listens to everything. And, so those people might be dead, but they're still their work is still doing. How do we live? We're living. What are we doing? Here we are. A little bit of me thinks that the reason we can do that with music is because it's not on the national curriculum. I mean, in schools, and that's a terrible thing to say. But I really do, because the one thing that is never taught is the two things that are never taught certainly at school, because they can't be, are one, pleasure, taking pleasure in this, enjoying the sound of the language, tearing out the lines that you love and kind of forgetting the ones that don't do it for you or don't do it for you today or don't do it for you yet. And being personal, seizing it and taking it back to your personal lair, which we all have. We all have our mental cave where we're inventing ourselves and reinventing ourselves. We furnish it with the stuff that really speaks to us. And objects of study very rarely get taken into that cave and I wish that they would. I think I was telling you before we started recording that, I I tripped over Ode to the West Wind when I was a kid because it was in a children's novel. A bit of it was quoted and it seemed amazing. And then I went away and read it. Well, I was reading the novel for pleasure. I was lying around in my bedroom or whatever, or on the lawn or whatever. And I was reading a book for pleasure. So I accessed it through pleasure. Had I accessed it through school, through the curriculum, through homework and chores, and I would have thought about it in the same way as I thought about quadratic equations, And that's a terrible truth. That's a terrible paradox of education. Because, of course, then it all comes down to just be a brilliant teacher and it'll be all fine.
I was very taken with what you were just saying. I always remember reading years ago a review of, I think it was Andrew Motion's biography of Keats. And it might have been, I kind of want to say Helen Vendler in the LRB. And one of the things she said that didn't quite come out of the biography, and one of the things that she loves most about Keats is just when you read the poems, you feel how excited he must have been about reading Chapman's Homer or seeing a lock of Milton's hair. That often it's just quite an ordinary thing, or that enthusiasm, that kind of utter. And when I was reading it, I thought, oh, that's it. I think that's why I like Keats. And I think when you were talking about Shelley, it's the same thing. It's just, I can't stop. Now it started. This poem could go on for bloody ever. But I don't know how you capture. You're right. How do you capture that within either a podcast or how do we get that? It's
very hard, isn't it? I'm sure you're right that reading aloud is one way, because you can't but enter into the poem to some extent when you read aloud, because it's your voice saying his voice. There's something very embodied about it, which is different from that kind of having to memorize and recite it aloud that we had to do at school. And I think too, like the great Keats odes, they're really beautiful, but also you can feel his mind moving. He takes whatever he's going to take and contemplates, and he just goes so far with the truth of it. It doesn't just settle for, this is a ceramic object, obviously about a meter high, and, he allows himself to notice what there really is to notice. And again, on the brink of perception, the raid on the inarticulate, the raid on the almost unperceived or imperceptible. And of course, the poem allows the reader to participate in that. But bringing people to realize that that's what's going on and that's what they're participating in. They're not participating in incredibly elegantly formed lines, though they are also. They are participating in this movement of thought. And that's really intimate. And I guess it's the kind of intimacy of the lyric tradition. That's one of the things about the lyric tradition, isn't it? One of the things that I always, say when I'm going into primary schools about, I say it in various ways, but, about poems, is that, poems show how disobedient they are. Even on the page, they don't go all the way across the page. They are a genre, which obviously I don't say in primary school, which advertises its own unreliability, own lack of omniscience, its own lack of scientific, technical faithfulness to the world. And of course, through that, they acquire more faithfulness because, if you go for what you really think and feel, you much more evoke the thing. And sometimes it's not a thing.
Yes, I always like the idea that with poems you can, they're often, Keats scribbled them in textbooks. As you say, Shelley's sitting watching Byron dash off poem after poem in 1816 and struggling to, but then looking up at Mont Blanc, starts thinking about all these sorts of things, or seeing things that you're not seeing. It's amazing, as you say, thought process to get into. I want to see what's not there, and there's a bit of it which feels like madness, and there's a bit of it which just, as you say, you're seeing a truth that.
Yes, when I'm teaching writing poetry, particularly writing poetry, I am absolutely maddened. Obviously I don't say I'm maddened, but when people say our poem is just describing. It absolutely isn't. A poem is not a photograph of the world. If something is not transformed, it's not a poem. And transformation can be all kinds, It can be cerebral, it can be musical, it can be in understanding, it can be all sorts of things. It can be into metaphor. But, I think a good question to ask yourself as a poet is, do you believe this is adding something to the sum of things in the world? I mean, obviously that would be a hubristic question, but if you could think that it was in some absolutely minuscule way, like one pixel, as it were, in the great picture of the world, it has some life, it does something in itself, then it's worth writing. But if you are just either trying to get your name in print or you're trying to record a thought of which you already know the answer, the completion, or describe something, I look up at the beam overhead. If I were to write a poem saying what the beam was like, the beam was there. The beam is doing beamness. A poem should be doing poemness. I always tell a story about, when I was an editor at Poetry Review, and, when the Boxing Day tsunami happened, I got so many poems in the postbag explaining with the force of revelation that tsunamis are tragic and good people die. Well, that's not a poem. There's nothing original in that insight. You are not the first person to grieve for the children of the village who died. Everybody knows it's a tragedy. That's not insight. It's nothing. It doesn't add to the
That's
world.
Probably why I've never written a poem. I can't imagine what I would. I can't imagine what.
Good for you. Yes, people who read poetry and don't write it.
One thing, Fiona, actually, I did notice in stanza 5, which we've just been talking about, Shelley remembering this youth of, I think, apparently setting his butler on fire with various the family butler. So there's a phrase which is in line 3 of stanza 5. While yet a boy, I sought for ghosts and sped through many a listening chamber, cave and ruin, and Starlight Wood. Now that did ring a bell because you very kindly sent me a proof of your new book, which is called Starlight Wood. As a way to perhaps round out our conversation, is just to talk a little bit about your new book and what does that phrase mean to you, and and how does it feed into your new book? And is Shelley present?
Shelley is present, yes, and he's also present as a ghost in a chapter about Elizabeth Browning and Robert Browning. And did you once see Shelley plain? Yeah, the half line that goes on after is, with fearful steps pursuing hopes of high talk with the departed dead. And in a way, I've cheated because I've made that positive, because my subtitle is Walking Back to the Romantic Countryside, because I am, as you'll have gathered from our conversation, really interested in a kind of impure reading of poems. That's to say, a reading of them as not othering them as a kind of inert canon, which is unreachable. The dead white male problem, I think, sometimes has to do with a sense of the canon as unreachable. It's a subsidiary problem, but it is a problem. But as works written by real people in real circumstance, which is certainly revelatory for oneself as in one's own struggles to write poetry, because you kind of put yourself in the process of the poem becoming in a different way from the way that you do if you kind of are an admiring kind of my passive youth, as Shelley calls it in this poem. But Starlight Wood is just a beautiful image, I think. Not starlit, but starlight. So that sense of trees with the canopy with either leaves or not, depending on what your imagination is doing, but the stars showing through them, rather like a Samuel Palmer painting, which is itself, of course, also a romantic image, because Samuel Palmer was a romantic. And that sense of that as very, for me, an image of the numinous immanent, which this poem is searching for, but also that sense of I wanted to walk through the British countryside, and which is, I think, a radical site, a site where radical things are going on or need to be going on as our climate erupts around us, and which was for the Romantics also a radical site, because it was undergoing radical change with the enclosures, people being forced off the land and into becoming the working poor of the Industrial Revolution, the urban poor. But also it was a place where they went to be radical because it was cheap, it was safe from observation, they could set up ideal communities. I mean, most of, not obviously people like William Godwin and Mary Wollstonecraft stayed in London and did their work there, but for the poets and artists, there's a lot of going out into the countryside to do their practice. And they are not doing it because they think the countryside is sweet and attractive and chocolate boxy in a way that it has become in British discourse today, and including in the political discourse and discourse around policy, which is, I think, one of the reasons our relationship with the countryside is so screwed up. And where did we get that from? We got that from the notion of the picturesque, which is a romantic notion. So we have misappropriated the romantic countryside and made it into this sweet wallpaper set of cliches, the hay wain, I wandered lonely as a cloud. Constables were the table mats at my grand's when I was growing up. They become invisible because they are just emptied out of meaning and resonance by their overfamiliarity. And I wanted to get back to the living, radical moment of encounter between the romantics and countryside. And I wanted to walk because of that sense of walking in their footsteps, and metaphorically and literally, also because slow travel is the way to be in environment and not to be in a tin box of any kind, but to be there. And walking also because I didn't want to be doing something more heroic. I think there's a tradition in British writing about place which tends to be written by a white male, forgive me, who goes off and does something, whether it's just walking in the Scottish mountains, but he kind of goes off and it's removed from life again. But actually, countryside the rural environment is all about dialectic. We form it, we shaped it, we're still shaping it, and it shapes us. And so the kind of intimacy of the detail seems to me what we should be remembering. And the romantics, of course, they did big idea stuff like wanting to set up ideal communities, but they also did intimate daily stuff like having particular diets and measuring and bringing in kind of customs around, how you frame a view. There's a kind of actual hands-on living engagedness in the romantic experience of that radical site, the countryside, I wanted to walk back to. So that's why it's Starlight Wood.
Is it a bit also, it sounds a bit, that idea of this Keats saying, I've got to go out and gain experience. So he goes off walking around, for the most part, the English, Scottish, a little bit the Irish countryside. And part of that is those extraordinary descriptions of seeing the lakes and the mountains, but also chance meetings, the equally extraordinary description of weird old woman that's been carried in this sort of box, and he thinks, for a life of her sensations, all of it. So it can be the sublime, but it also can be just meeting different people, seeing how they dance or don't dance in Scotland. So is it that sort of experience?
Absolutely, yes, that too, exactly. And why one shouldn't forget that, in a sense that, the romantics brought in the idea of recreational walking. They're walking at a time when, it's really déclassé to walk. As someone like George Borrow points out, even tinkers and so on have carts and Roma communities. But, they want to do these walking tours. They want to, Wordsworth and his university friends, whatever, they want to go out and have the experience. And that's part of their sense of engagement. It's not wallpaper, it is an engaged experience.
Which artists and writers are you looking at?
Well, there are 10 walks, and I walked only in Britain because that was the commission to think about British romanticism. Otherwise, it's just too vast, because obviously, actually, the vibrant, the beating heart of it would be the European romanticism, the European landscape. So, and the walks aren't necessarily in, the Lake District and the Quantocks. They are in different parts of Britain, because I wanted to kind of bring the idea of, romanticism, that quality of engagement. It's not just a historical thing. It's happening. Sorry, it's happening in the countryside now, the legacies or whatever, and you can go out and take. You will be taking that history with you when you go walk wherever. I also took 10 activities: so eating, settling, traveling, speeding, measuring, and I did base it on Rousseau's Reveries of the Solitary Walker, where he's pretty solipsistic. Actually, he has great passages on walking and the rural environment and how much it matters to him. but quite a lot of the time he's chewing over, past wrongs that have been done to him. So he's walking, but walking is something that happens outside the body, but also happens in his head. And I've tried to do that too. So it's partly biography, partly writing about place, partly kind of cultural history in a way. So I've got Constable and Dedham Vale, and the landscape's uninhabited or less inhabited because the enclosures are happening. There are no people. I've got Turner and Rain, Steam, Speed and the Great Western Railway, and then Elizabeth Bat Browning, seeing those trains, and Mendelssohn going to Fingal's Cave and being terribly seasick, but how Mendelssohn went because of Scott and Ossian, and how Ossian was a complete fake, but how that was really influential across Europe. And so when he was on a concert tour in London, he trekked up to Scotland to see the sights, to see Scottishness, and he wanted to collect again the barefoot natives and their customs. I've got Percy Bysshe and Mary and Claire going up Mont Blanc, which obviously is not in Britain. I've got Edward Lear framing a view outside Thessaloniki, and then how it's framed in different accounts at the time. I've got George Borrow. I've got Shelley again in the Elan Valley, which of course is now underwater, and his sort of first struggles with the idea of the picturesque, and is it something that we are contriving or is it something imminent? My favourite chapter probably is about Dart. It's about Shelley's vegetarianism and his language, the disgusted language, a language about meat eating, which is really similar to kind of language about sexual disease and sexuality, and it overlaps with Blake and how Elizabeth Bat Browning, when the Brownings are in Florence, they go to the Hopners, who were the consuls in Venice when the Shelleys' daughter died and had to be buried there, and so took the Shelleys in. And Mrs. Hopner, who was then 20 years before, was the wife, tempts Percy to eat some beef. Oh, just eat a little slice of beef, Mr. Shelley. You are so thin. And also quite flirtatious and charming. And she tells this to Elizabeth Barrett Browning and Robert 20 years later. Elizabeth writes about it to family back home, which is how we know. And how, who's sitting in that chair now? And what about Mary? Was she offered any? Mary, who's just lost her child. And then is that the origin of, and did you want to see Shelley Plain? That laugh again, because I think you think of Mrs. Hopner as laughing, and not saying it is, but say, there's that whole chain of, and then Elizabeth's own, ill health and her, not vegetarianism, but the opposite for her, her life as a sort of, as it were, an out romantic is much more experimenting with lots of different things, Chianti and roasted thrushes and lots of things like that, and being able to pick an orange from the tree. And so for her, it's voluptuousness, whereas for Shelley, it's the opposite.
Is it Robert Browning that has that little quotation about Keats eating porridge?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, I'm just thinking the Browning's obviously obsessed with romantic eating. But that's sort of interesting.
Well, yes, and because they were there in Italy again. It's that same thing about embodiment, isn't it? You suddenly, if you're going to live where your heroes lived, all sorts of things arise that would have been part of experience in a different way. Yeah. And
in that now, I think it's very interesting that idea that we should go out now and experience, not necessarily in that slightly sort of heritagey or sort of fetishy way. Let's sit where Emily Dickinson. I remember going to the Emily Dickinson house, which is, I think, the one house that absolutely
exactly.
This is the house that you can see, because she never seems to sort of go too far away from it. But so there's a different kind of experience you're asking. But is there something about walking in the footsteps? I guess it's sort of the Richard Holmes sort of idea that retracing those steps. I do remember going to the house in Rome for the first time, probably 3 decades ago now, and slightly sort of bursting into tears, and recently reading Clive James actually walking up the steps when he was much older and very unwell, and pondering if only Keats had just lived a bit longer and got penicillin and things like this. There is something about sometimes putting your foot in these places, and it can be quite a literal thing about thinking about Keats or Shelley, but a bigger thing is, which you're obviously trying to touch on. But does that happen for you? Do you can you lose yourself?
Absolutely, it does. Yes, absolutely. I remember going to Keats one year on Keats's death day. I hadn't realised it was until I sort of, messaged someone back home, and they said, well, you do realise what today's date is, don't you? And, looking up at that coffered ceiling with the blue and the roses, which he would have looked up as he was dying. I mean, it's very, very, very moving. And yeah, if you fall for any of them, you can't but feel it does feel extraordinary to Hopes of High Talk with the Departed Dead. I mean, you do gain something from proximity. Actually, something slightly different. But after I'd written a Mary Shelley biography and it come out and everything, and I got contacted by an art dealer, an antiques art dealer, who, long story short, had acquired a bust said to be of Mary Shelley by a Roman sculptor for whom she would have sat. I worked out the dates and it was highly likely. And he said, well, come and see it. And I went to see it. It was in one of those warehouses near Heathrow, and you go into a viewing room and there it was on its pedestal. And I burst into tears because seeing the face of this bust, it absolutely made sense to me of who Mary Shelley was. Oh, yes, of course. And it was extraordinary because I really did sort of fall for Mary Shelley. I just found her an extraordinary person, leaving aside Frankenstein and whatever an achievement it is, but just her personal qualities, her kind of literal mindedness, her slight geekiness, her idealism, and the way some people thought of her as beautiful and others not. She was even quite straight nose, quite sort of like a classical profile in a way, not the opposite of a kind of simpering Claire Clairmont. I mean, you could see in it absolutely someone who wouldn't have known how to flirt, obviously I'm reading things into marble, but it was just this absolute shock of actually like really meeting the person you've been thinking about for 3 years.
I hope we can talk more about that. I got really into reading her diary actually a while back. I love all the lists of all the books that she and Shelley have been reading. This sort of, and then I felt terribly sorry if I was reading about the endless sort of speculation what happened to Shelley's heart, and I thought Leigh Hunt actually was unforgivable.
Living with her, but living off her. The way all Shelley's hangers-on vilified her. And obviously, it seems to me, he was vilifying her behind her back. Oh, it's so awful. My wife doesn't understand me. It's the oldest, line in the book. And they all fell for it. And that's, of course, why they were so hostile to her. They didn't see her as the keeper of the flame. It's just so awful. And that she just didn't get that. And she trusted Jane Williams. She kept trusting Jane Williams. And, even had a crush on Jane Williams. It's a vast, I have so much I could say about Mary Shelley, but that's something else.
Thank you. So it's such a pleasure to talk to you.
Yeah, it's really great to meet you. It's a really good conversation. I really loved it. So let's do some more. Yeah, fantastic. And thanks so much.
Thank you for listening to the Keats-Shelley podcast. This podcast is hosted by James Kidd. The music is Androids Always Escape by Chris Zabriskie. Visit chriszabriskie.com. You can hear more episodes and also subscribe to the podcast by visiting our homepage, keatsshelley.podbean.com. You can support the Keats-Shelley House by becoming a friend of the Keats-Shelley Memorial Association. Visit keatsshelley.org and click Support Us.